Last week we started our introductory lesson of the book of Leviticus. I'm not going to go back and read through those outlines, that outline of introduction, but I do want to pay attention to lesson 2, which has the area of the temple and the temple courts connected with the tabernacle of Moses' day. That's what we're dealing with in the book of Leviticus. And it'll tie in what we're speaking about in the offerings. And I want to pay attention to the altar of burnt offerings. I could give you pictures that men have set forth to be what that altar was like. And if you're not careful, you'll get Solomon's temple, and their altar was gigantic, the altar compared to what we have in Moses' day. And there's different views. Where were there stones leading up the ramp? Was it acacia wood? That sort of thing. So I thought I'd just keep it as a square, rectangle type thing. And we'll put the dimensions in our mind about the altar. And we go back to Exodus and we realize that the altar was a certain dimension that we have brought forth in Exodus, the 27th chapter and verse 1. It speaks about thou shalt make the altar of acacia wood. If you ever see that type of a tree in that area, they were prevalent. They're not going to get big as a pine tree, but they would grow to a certain height, but their wood was used for furniture and for different types of wood carvings, things that took place during that day. And so they were to use that. And so how many cubits long? 5 cubits long at 7.5 feet by 7.5 feet. You could put an animal that's been parted upon that altar. Now, when you get to Solomon's temple, and 2 Corinthians 4, verse 1, it's 30 feet wide and 30 feet long. 30 feet. And 15 feet high. So that's quite a bit larger than what we're speaking about here in the tabernacle setting. And so, and what materials is made of, I know exactly it's made of acacia wood. Over it was, you talk about brass, but that was copper. Brass is an alloy of copper and tin. And that was, copper is a very good one of conducting heat. And that acacia wood was covered, probably to keep the heat from burning up the wood, as just siding all around the altar, the grate, and the particular, what they would hold, they would carry that was acacia wood. It would be covered with copper, or the Bible says brass, but it was probably the copper color, the brownish red color that it would be giving. So that would be part of it. So it had a height. It was 3 cubits high, which was 4.5 feet. And I think I'd like you just think about that. There's the brazen altar. I know the dimensions are not the same, but it is right before when you enter from the east into the gate of the temple. What do you see first? What is the first thing in your way as you go to the holy and the most holy place? It was in their eyesight, and it was sacrifice. It was an altar. And we shall see in this first chapter how important it was for Moses to begin with the Levites in speaking about that altar and the things that were being offered upon it at the very beginning. We'll talk about that. So those were the dimensions. That's a pretty large, 7.5 by 7.5, 4.5 feet high. And what it would be hollowed. It'd be hollowed inside because that's where the ashes were collected. They had particular utensils in which to get the ashes out, as we'll see that ashes were heaped up, at least on the east side of the altar. What would be the east? Would be kind of as one entered into the area, that's where they would keep the ashes, and as they were, I guess they would pile up and they would take care of that. There's rules to doing that. So what we'll see tonight is that something was offered on the north side of the altar. Do you in the picture see anything on the north side of the altar that would be in the way? No, there'll be something there, and that's where they would kill the animal as they're about to present it to the priest for offering upon the altar. What's to the west? To our left here. What was between the tabernacle and there was the bronze laver of water, in which they would wash their hands and their feet. The priest would, before they offer their sacrifices. What's on the south side? And on the east side would be the ashes. The west side, north side would be where they'd have the offering. The offering. Why didn't they do it on the east side? That was probably the ramp that would go up to where the priest could then offer the sacrifice that they were to build. Some have said that was of stone that you were not to lay a hammer to. They would put the rocks, unhewn stone that would bring it up, and there was understanding. Don't you show your nakedness, priest, when you go up those hills. Go up that ramp to the sacrificial altar. And so there would be a ramp on this side, ashes on the east side, brazen laver on the west side. On the north side, it was the idea of traffic flow in some ways. That was where you're going to be offering the sacrifice. That's where the sacrifice would be killed, and then it would be presented to the priest upon the altar. So those are the things that we're going to be observing about the burnt offerings that would take place on that particular altar. So I want us to go, we're not going to, you can read this if you want to go back and look at it. But in lesson 2 in verse 1, we want to get to the offerings. We talked about the idea of the title of the book. It's a idea of God speaking to the people out of the tent of meeting, and we talk about how come it's not called that. God is speaking, but it's the idea that he's going to be speaking to them out of the tent of meeting. This is where my presence is. This is how my sacrifices are going to be offered, and it pertains to the Levites, which will be that priestly tribe in which they have specific instructions, and we don't begin with all the detailed instructions at the beginning, I think for a good reason. But we just have the offerings being talked about right up at the beginning. We began to see them set forth. As I mentioned in the lesson last week, we'll be looking at these lessons 2 and 3, and they will deal with these various sacrifices. We're going to be looking at 3 of them this evening in this first lesson, or lesson 2 of our questions. And then we'll be looking at the next 2 as we go through these first 7 chapters. So a lot of detail in each one is given, but we realize a lot of them would be repetitious in the various types of sacrifices, but we kind of want to make some distinctions if we can, way it can have some meaning to us. Why does he start off with these offerings the way he does? And what happens, the last 2 that he deals with, the sin offering and the trespass offering, we made a distinction between those. Trespass, when I've wronged somebody and have to pay something in extra to make it right. Sin offering, our sins before God. And a lot of times it was being ceremoniously clean, like a woman giving birth, she'd have to offer a sin offering. It wasn't because of inherited sin or anything like that, but it's the idea of being pure before God, ceremoniously so, and we'd be seeing that. But sometimes it was for sin, and that was very important. So I'm asking at the very beginning, and you're going to have to read through things, you may have to do some studying, but just to get our questions and our minds thinking, how do the first 3 offerings differ from the sin and trespass offerings that we'll see in the next section? Do you tackle that? Yes.
Well, first off, these first 3 are free will. The others, the sin and trespass, will require.
I think you nailed it. These were free will offerings. They're not demanded for the occasion, as you say here. There was sin I've committed. We offer the sacrifice for that sin. I became aware of my sin, and therefore I offer. That's exactly what I see is different. These are free will offerings. We'll look at these peace offerings as really thanksgiving unto God. Is your heart full of thanksgiving? You might want to offer a peace offering to God. And the very first of these offerings is the fact that It's not necessarily I have to offer a sacrifice for my sin, but you might not get that. Because when we look at Danny, I think you're right about that. But when we read in our Bibles and we start reading verse 4, he shall lay his hand upon the head of the burnt offering, it shall be accepted him to make atonement for him. We're so conditioned by atonement connected with our specific sins. We have to be made, we talk at one mint. That's how we kind of deal with that. The idea of reconciliation, I want to be at one with God. But it's the idea of pacifying God. It's the idea of covering, a covering from God's wrath, his propitiation, his wrath. I didn't think I did anything. I thought these were free will offerings. They are. But why does he start with the burnt offering as being one of those free will offerings? We have not a specific sin, but we're looking at atonement. And it has to deal with this burnt offering and the concept of bringing our gifts to another. And we won't go into a lot of detail with that, but when we speak about the burnt offering, we begin to realize that we talked a little bit about this. He'll talk about being a whole burnt offering. The entire animal was offered unto God, and therefore it was called whole burnt offerings. And we talked about how down the road Christ would fulfill that perfectly. The body hast thou prepared for me to do thy will, O God. Burnt offerings, whole burnt offerings, that would accept, but I came to do your will. Those offerings of the bulls, the bullock, and what we'll see of the other animals here, was not going to suffice for that. It would take Jesus Christ. That was God's plan. But the point is that it's accepting the person. Not about his sin. It's accepting the person. God will accept me as a person. And I am here totally dedicated unto him. Yes, I'm imperfect. Yes, I'm going to have to offer sin offerings. But the reason it's atonement here is the picture of accepting the person. Notice as I want to hit on some things in verses 1 through 4. Jehovah called unto Moses, spake unto him out of the tent of meeting, saying, speak unto the children of Israel, and say that when any man of you bringeth, now your translations, a lot of translations, I'm not going to get this distinction, but the American Standard, being specific, gives us two words. He says, when you offereth, I'm bringing something before God, and you offer what? An oblation is what the American Standard says. All you get is offering my offering. Oblation was a word denoting the fact of it's distinguished from offering because it's korban. Now, what does korban ring a bell with you in your reading of the New Testament? Yes, Mark 12:8. That part was dedicated to God. That what could have been given to my parents, it's korban. And Mark's account had to tell you, because he's speaking to Greek people, and he had to tell them what that kind of meant, korban, as a Hebrew would use that. And it starts way back here. I'm offering an oblation. It's dedicated unto God. And that's the greatest thing you could do. You could offer up something to God and say, well, I'm sorry, my parents can't be held because I'm offering this dedicated unto God. So it wasn't just, there's bringing forth something, there's your offering, but it's an oblation. It is a offering that is given of dedicated to God, and I'm dedicating the person. That's why the person needs atonement. Not that we can separate ourselves from our sins, but in these sacrifices, because these are voluntary. They are those that are connected not with a specific sin. It's how to accept my person. And that's what a gift was. And we're speaking here of the total dedication unto God and God accepting the person. What a way to begin your book. Chapter 1. Let's get to the real part. Will God accept you? And what about the imperfect person? Well, we'll get that in the last two. But there's the joy of fellowship. It's the joy of being received by God. It's a joy of being remembered by God. That's what these particular sacrifices are in these first three that we're looking at. And they have a concept. And if we get the concept, then we realize, I see how things were pointing to the cross and how things were going to be fulfilled in Jesus without making all the little details the same. Because we think of Christ's blood shed, it was the lamb. But here you have bullocks, and you have goats, and you have birds, and you have pigeons, and you have all sorts of the different animals. And so, because of what we're going to have to deal with, if you lived at this time, and even we're not that far removed from people who lived and worked and ate off the farm. Think about these sacrifices that are being offered. I know you'd find the doves and the turtle doves and the pigeons, and those would be flying around. But what did you have for your sustenance on the farm if you were a Jew in this time? I mean, they didn't have an H-E-B or a Kroger. And yet, they had a way of feeding the Levites as they would be serving in the temple. They had a way of feeding themselves. And they got their food from their animals. What would they be? From the herd, from the flock. There would be the birds that they could gather. They would be available to them. And they were used to slaughtering animals. Are you used to that? Now, I know you may have lived on a farm. Yeah, I did that. I know what Grandma did. She wrung that neck of that chicken, and I'd see her working. And I've got grandmoms like that too. I've got a grandmom that was like that. The other one didn't work on the farm. But they had no problem wringing the neck of the chicken. Would you? I have a problem killing a squirrel in this building. We had to do it. And we're not used to that. So that kind of maybe turn your stomach. And they say, I just can't do that. Would you be a good Jew? Yeah, you would. Because you're around this all the time. This is how you got your sustenance, your daily food. There would be the meal offerings. There would be the flour and that sort of thing, making the cakes and all that. You'd eat that. You'd have that. You'd have your protein. You'd have the things that you're growing, first fruits that are being brought forth from your field and from your flock and from your herd. So we wouldn't have a problem with that if we lived in that time, because we're used to that. We're used to having to do that. And it's interesting that in these cases, who killed the animal? The priest? No. Who severed the animal in its proper pieces? The priest? No, you did. I did. I don't know how to quarter beef. You may. I've seen deer quarter. I've seen how do we dress deer. I've had a taste of that, or not a taste of it, but I've seen it. And you get used to that sort of thing. It's not a big thing. I remember as a boy, I was drinking tomato juice while we were skinning deer. And a preacher walked up and he got sick. He had a weak stomach. What did you think it was all about? I'm just drinking tomato juice. I didn't think about that. Because it was a hot season, we had to skin them. And I didn't even think about that. But that bothered him, and he just turned around and walked away. And I realized, hey, that's probably wasn't a good scene to be looking at. But if you were on the farm, if you were here, you wouldn't have minded that. I mean, they would capture the blood after they would cut the throat of the animal. That's how they killed them. They didn't have shotgun and that sort of thing to put them out of misery with a headshot. They had a very sharp knife, and that's where they would collect the blood. The blood would be splashed upon. I'm not going to go in more detail than that. It splashed the blood on the altar. They were accustomed to blood and animals, and at the same time, it allowed them to say, I hate sin. I hate when those things were offered for my sins. That was not a pretty picture to look at, even for them. But they would bring what was special to them. My sheep, my bullock. I've been raising them. I've been feeding them. And it has no blemish, God. It has no blemish at all. And that would be inspected by the priest. There'd be one inspecting as you bring it in to the court. And they would be inspected by them to see if that was an offering that was suitable unto God. And then you would be received as a person in the burnt offering. No sins dealt with, but atonement was. Will God accept me as I'm dedicating myself unto Him, free will dedication unto Him? Will He accept my sacrifice? And He'll make and the priest will make atonement. They would put the parts on the altar. There would be a grate there to place it upon. The fire's been burning. After the first lighting of the fire, that burnt offering never went out. The fires never went out. Morning and evening, they offer up sheep. They were connected with a meal offering. A lot of these we're going to talk about the meal offering and that sort of thing. We'll see how they're connected with a lot of the offerings as we go through the book. But I wanted to ease your mind that I just don't think I could do that. We don't like the sight of blood, especially our own. But we don't, and it's not a pretty picture. We don't around, but you were around that if you're going to get your evening meal a lot of times. And that was just part of their life. But it showed something special. And it showed I don't have the wherewithal to offer a bullock. I don't have any lamb to offer. But I might be offering some birds. And God allowed offerings that would accommodate all people, can have access unto me, even though they don't have the wherewithal as others would. Jesus' parents would offer 2 turtle doves, 2 pigeons was offered. In Leviticus 12:8, you would be able to do that. And it was a sign of poverty. You didn't have that, but you could get the 2 turtle doves or the 2 pigeons and offer. Why are not birds offered as peace offerings? Why don't you have any birds and peace offerings? I don't have any money. Because that's the other side of peace offerings that we need to understand. And I'll just say it up front. There's where your fellowship was, because God gets a part, Aaron gets a part, and you get a part. You try to divide up a pigeon that way. You try to divide up a dove that way. There was not enough food, not enough meat for birds to be peace offerings. And so you don't have them listed. And what you do have is at the beginning of this book, the burnt offerings are talked about. And they differ, and the other 2 with it, the meal offerings, the peace offerings, they're dealing with, as Dan said, it's free will. Others were a constraint that you have something to deal with. And now I've made known your sin if you didn't know about it, and you were to offer up the sin offering. Add a fifth to it. If it was the trespass offering, you hurt somebody, you harmed them. Not only you pay restitution, but you add 20% more. That was the law. And that's what we're looking at. Any questions on these are the animals that they raised? A lot of times they were around that. So the idea of killing it and dividing it, that wasn't any problem with them. Now, I'm not saying the wife had to do it. The man could represent the family and those things, have her represented, but it wasn't the priest. And that's what, we think the priest is cutting up food, cutting up the animal and putting it on. They had the parts. Now, one more thing. You'll see things they were to put it in order. How do you put an animal that you've cut into proper pieces? Because you had to wash the inwards, which was the bowels, the stomach, and the side of the legs. You had washing there, and we'll talk more about that. Plus, you sever the part of the feet and were severed above the knee, and you had all the parts. How do you put that in order? And most commentators said, well, they put it in order as the beast looked. You put the parts back where they go. But they've been severed. What kind of meaning would that be? Here was that beautiful lamb, and here, because I want myself to be accepted, he's taking the place for me. And I'm identifying myself with that animal. And it had to be broken into pieces. That's what it looks like in real life if they're all together. But death, and there is a separation. He put it in order on the fire. And then it was totally consumed by fire. And that was the law. And these burnt offerings were offered twice a day. Meal offerings were offered with it as well. So that's kind of the things we're looking at. But let's look at some specifics. Where it says, why is there a variety of offerings under the heading of burnt offerings, meal offerings, and peace offerings? We talked about that. A lot of times you might not have particular items, but when we talk about burnt offerings, let's talk about totally dedication unto God. The meal offerings, or the meat offerings, were those that were offered unto God. And of course, Aaron and his sons would get a portion of that as well. Free will offerings that I'm offering to God. We might not have the oxen that we're offering, but we might be able to offer the meal offerings and so forth. The peace offerings are those that indeed God is getting his part, and what was always God getting. If you offered sheep, you offered the fat of the tail. What I could read about the sheep in that time, those tails with the fat could be about 15 pounds. Some say it went to 50, but 15 pounds. Fat and blood belonged to God. That's his food. We weren't to eat that. So there would be the membrane of the liver that had the fat around that. As all that was washed, that would be offered unto God. And that would be burnt unto God. And then portions of the meal offering. But the peace offerings is a very definite one of having fellowship one with another through a sacrifice. Don't we have that in 1 John 1, verse 8? Don't we have that when we realize that we have fellowship one with another? I have fellowship with God. And that because we have fellowship with the same God, we can have fellowship with one another if we continue to walk in the light. Part of walking in the light as a Jew was to realize that here's an oblation that symbolizes that. Here's accepting my person, and I am, part of it is going to the priest. God, you're getting your portion, I get the rest. And I then can partake of that with others around me. And we brought in Proverbs, the 7th chapter, where that woman entices the young man to come to her house, and because I've offered up my vow offerings, which was a peace offering. It has to be eaten that night and the next day. And so he, growing up with all these religious background, he might not think, it might disarm him. Well, she needs someone to take it with. I guess I need to be the one. And he's going to his doom. But there were burnt offerings and meal offerings and peace offerings. They were offerings, and they were accepting the person, but it was a free will of thanksgiving because we're having fellowship with you. There's your peace offerings. And the idea of joy, of fellowship. And these offerings, we might as well hit this. In your King James Version, you have meat offerings, and it's a bunch of flour and grain. What's that all about? Meat was food. And here was just the meal offerings, and that word mishna is the Hebrew term that denoted that someone who is inferior is offering something to who is higher than they are. We are offering it up to God. And it was that Hebrew word is designating that, not that it was beef. It wasn't beef. It wasn't meat. It was food. And it could be from the grain, and that's why it's called a meal offering in other translations. That word was an offering that was just offering the grain that they had from their fields and offering unto God. Well, we have also the idea of offering the first fruits. And there was things that could offer up for first fruits that you could not offer as a peace offering and meal offering. So as we go through it, we'll deal with that. Any questions or something you'd like to add to things. I think those are the big obstacles we have. I've talked about why is the concept of atonement 1:4 in chapter 1:4 connected with burnt offerings which are distinct from sin or trespass offerings. Atonement, if I were to make a distinction, and it makes sense to me, I am wanting for God to accept me in my person, and I also have sins that I'll take care of in other sacrifices. But is accepting the person who's what? I'm offering a whole burnt offering, and this is my total dedication unto you. Accept my person. And we don't have time to go through all the places you find that word is used. Idea when you went to a king, you better bring an offering, a gift. And it was this Mishnah. It was bringing that gift to one that you recognize as higher above you, is showing humility. But there's the idea of atonement, even though it is separated here from actual sins that are committed. Question number 4, what does whole burnt offering have to do with the spiritual concept of the burnt offering? It was a whole burnt offering that was indeed dedicated unto God. Verse 1 and verse 9, but the inwards and its legs shall we wash with water. That's what I was saying a while ago. That would happen. The priest shall burn the whole on the altar for a burnt offering, an offering made by fire, and the smell of that burnt animal was pleasing to God. Totally offered unto him. And that the concept is the idea of total dedication. I think that's easy to see. Question 5, what is the significance of laying the hand upon the sacrificial animal? And so we begin to have a concept. And of course, when we go over there into the sin offerings, and we'll get into Leviticus 16, the Day of Atonement, the goat that put your hands on it, takes away your sin, is not killed. It's not the one killed. So let's begin, and we'll get to the details of things. Let's begin with the concept here, as if we accept atonement apart from offering for my sins, but as a person. What did it mean when I laid my hands on the animal for a burnt offering? What it means to a lot of people, I'm transferring my sins unto the animal. You really believe that? And if you do, Calvinism is not far away with the concept that, well, my sins were transferred to Jesus on the cross. Really? Where do you read that? And you might get ideas from the idea he took my sins, he carried them on himself to the cross. And the point is, no, that would be transferring my sins to another. And that is not true. Then why would you think I'm transferring my sins to the animal that's offered up in Old Testament times? Laying my hands on them. And so concepts quickly go, and you just have to, I want to question that. Maybe I need to back off the Calvinist. Maybe there is a transfer of my sins to another, even when he says, the sins belong to yourself. That Jesus, for my sake, became sin. Yeah, he became sin because my sins were transferred to him. That's what most people believe. I don't. But maybe I should. Because, see, these were things pointing to Christ. Whole burnt offering, total dedication unto God. Well, they laid their hands upon them, but we don't have any sins to be transferred here. That's sin offering. What we do have is the person. I'm transferring myself to be accepted through these sacrifices. Accept me as a person. I'm identifying with my animal. Not that my sins are transferred to him, but I'm identifying my person with that animal. Will you accept me? Thank you. And he would. And he would. So laying the hand is identifying myself with the person. Now, if we want to go with sins, and we'll deal with that. But everywhere I read from here on out, sin of atonement, the atonement, I can understand that concept. And we'll get to the 16th chapter, hopefully, and we'll deal with that. But I've had to rethink my thinking of being very careful of what we have and really realize that Jesus took the guilt he paid the penalty for my sin to the cross. He took my sins because he paid the penalty for my sins. Not that my sins were transferred onto the other. Well, we have inherited sin. You don't like that? Well, why not? You transferred it to the sacrifice. And yet the place of the atonement in Leviticus 16, you had an offering for the sin, but the one that carried away the sins, he just let loose a life that carried the sins away. So sins are being carried away, but maybe somebody's paying the penalty for it. And that's the concept I think we have. And to then back up and start looking at it this way, I realize I'm a little prejudiced now. And if I've missed something, I will. But when I'll read Leviticus through, no, there's nothing contradicts that concept. It is a point that I think is a point of distinction that's worth talking about. But you make up your own mind about it. But I would have a hard time. I'd feel like a hypocrite if I'm saying sins are not transferred to another. That inherited sin business is not true. But I do believe my sins were transferred to Jesus. Do you? Well, then why? I guess you don't believe too much about sins being transferred. No, Jesus was innocent. And he took our sins. Yeah, he carried my sins far away. I sing it all the time. Well, what's your concept of that? And if it could be that he didn't take on my guilt, but he paid the price, he paid the penalty. And that's what the Bible consistently teaches. And so laying hands on that, because I'm placing my hands, this one identifies with me. Now I'll take it to the hand of the priest, who after I kill it, and after I sever its parts, what it's supposed to be, he'll place it in order upon the sacrifice. He's offering up a sacrifice for me. The priest comes before me in God and accepts my person. But there's the sense of laying on the hands. Now, you have another concept about that? That's fine. David? But can you see laying the hand on the animal? You would automatically go there because we'll see it with the animal and sin offerings. And there's a little more details of that. So let's just say, not yet. Let's take the whole Bible, and we don't have time to get to chapter 16. Yes, sir.
What about responsibility? Remember that David said he could not take a sacrifice if he didn't pay for it? By laying on the hand, you're showing you're responsible for these actions and offering the sacrifice.
And it's still death, and it's still killing an innocent animal, isn't it? And that was probably the thing, to accept my person. That's there's part of responsibility as well. How is blood and water applied to the burnt offerings? We already know the killing of the animal. They would take, and it's interesting to see some of the details that some rabbis teach at the horns. How many corners of the horns did you have on that altar? You had 4 as they were coming together, but they're kind of a horn type shape. And some have said, well, it was hollowed out and there was a little cup on the horns. They didn't splash that blood all around. They poured out that blood in each of those containers on those 4 horns. One rabbi taught that. Well, I didn't read it here, but I hear it throwing, casting, as if it splashed all sides of the altar. To me, that would be a concept that I could see happening. But then were you to wash the inwards? Yes. And the legs, they were to be washed. So you had the shedding of blood, you had the application of blood, you had blood and water. Some would say, well, there's Jesus Christ. What happened to him after he died? Out came what? When they threw a spear into him. Blood and water. Is that talking about this, pointing to that? I don't have a connection from the Bible on that. But the idea, does blood and water come together in baptism? Are we baptized into Jesus' death, where he shed his blood? Are we washed in water? That's true. That's how we come in contact with the blood of Christ. It's through baptism, and that's indeed with water. Our time is up, but we'll start with question number 7. Why could translations present the offering as meat offerings? We talked about that. We'll start there, and then we'll continue on with lesson 2.